The rain comes sideways off the Gulf, and the bus shelter does nothing to stop it. A young man sits on the cold metal bench with a duffel bag between his boots and $17 folded in his front pocket, and he is counting the change a third time, hoping the number changes. It does not. The ticket north cost $41. He has been awake for 2 days. The dog at his feet has not eaten since yesterday morning. That young man was Cole Renner, and the dog was a German shepherd named Birch, and the town was a coastal Louisiana fishing community called Marsh Landing. And the year was a long way from where this story finally goes. If a story about a debt that took 10 years to come due is the kind of thing that stays with you, settle in, and let it run all the way to the end, because the part that matters most is the part nobody saw coming. Cole was 23 then, and freshly out of the Marine Corps, discharged after a vehicle rollover, in training crushed 2 vertebrae, and ended a career he had loved more than he knew how to say. He had no people to go back to. His mother was 4 years dead. His father had been a name on a child support file, and nothing more. The Corps had been the first thing that ever felt like a roof, and now even that was gone. And the only thing the Corps let him keep was the dog. Birch had been a working dog flagged for early retirement, a tan black animal with a black saddle across his back and one ear that had been notched in a kennel fight before Cole ever met him. The two of them had been paired for 11 months. When the discharge came through, a quiet sergeant pulled strings nobody asked about and put the dog in Cole's truck instead of back in a kennel, and said only that some partnerships should not be broken by paperwork. Cole had driven the truck until it died outside Marsh Landing, sold it for parts, and walked the last 6 miles into town with the dog beside him. He had been trying to reach a VA clinic in Shreveport that had a bed for transitional housing. He had a date and a phone number and not enough money, and the rain had been falling for 3 days, and the bench in the bus shelter was the driest place he had found in 11 hours. A woman crossed the lot toward him through the storm, hunched under a clear plastic poncho, carrying 2 grocery bags that the wind kept trying to take. She was old, easily 70, small and bent at the shoulders, with white hair pinned under a knit cap gone gray at the edges. She set her bags down inside the shelter, out of breath, and looked at the young man and the dog, the way some people look at weather, deciding whether it would pass. Her name was Delphine Aucoin, and she had run a small breakfast counter 2 blocks over for 31 years, and she had buried a husband and a son, and kept opening the place at 5 in the morning anyway, because that was what her hands knew how to do. She did not introduce herself that day. She just looked at the dog a long time, and then at the boy's boots, and then at the duffel bag, and she understood the arithmetic of it without being told. "That dog hasn't eaten," she said. It was not a question. Cole did not answer right away. Pride is a slow thing to climb down off of. Then he said quietly that they were fine, that the bus would come soon. She knew the bus schedule the way she knew the tide tables. The next northbound bus would not come until morning. She opened her coin purse there in the wet light of the shelter, and she counted out what she had, and it came to $1 and a few cents in change, and a single folded bill, soft from handling, that she pressed flat against her palm before she held it out. It was the last of what she had until the counter opened the next day and the first customers paid for coffee. She did not say that part. She would never have said that part. She held the dollar out across the small, cold distance between them and said the thing that Cole would carry for 10 years. "A man and his dog should eat," she said. "Everything else can wait till morning." He tried to refuse. She would not let him. She told him the diner across the road sold a hot plate for under $3 and would give the dog scraps if she called ahead, and that she was going to call ahead whether he took the money or not, so he might as well take it. Then she picked up her grocery bags and went back out into the rain before he could think of an argument that would hold. He watched her go. Birch watched her go too, ears up, his whole body turned to follow her into the storm, and the dog made a low sound in his chest that was not a growl, but something closer to grief. The sound a working dog makes when something he has decided to guard walks away from him. Cole bought the hot plate. He gave half of it to the dog. That He slept in the shelter, and in the morning he found the breakfast counter 2 blocks over, and he learned her name from the sign painted above the door, and he went in to give the dollar back. She would not take it. She poured him coffee instead and put a plate in front of the dog without being asked, and she told him to sit and dry out. And for 2 days until the next bus came, that small bent woman fed a stranger and his dog, and asked for nothing in return except that he eat what she put in front of him. The counter was a narrow room with 6 stools and a grill. She worked herself, her back to the customers, her hands moving the way hands move when they have done a thing 10,000 times. There were 2 other regulars those mornings, an old shrimper who nursed a single cup for an hour, and a mail carrier who came in before her route. And Delphine knew their orders without asking, and knew Cole's by the second morning, eggs and grits and a biscuit, and a bowl of scraps set down for the dog by the door where he would not be stepped on. She did not pry. She asked him once where he was headed, and once whether his back hurt him, and when he answered short, she let it lie. The rest of the time she just talked, low and easy, about the town and the tide and a son who had loved a dog of his more than anything, a son she did not say had died, though Cole understood it in the way she said loved. The dog watched her the whole time from his spot by the door. Birch had never warmed to strangers fast. He warmed to her by the first afternoon, and Cole had learned to trust that read more than any words a person said. When the bus finally came, he stood in the doorway of her counter, with the duffel on his shoulder, and he tried to say what he owed her, and the words would not come. She waved them off. She told him the world was thin on people who showed up, and that if he wanted to thank her, he should be one of the people who showed up, somewhere, for someone, someday. Then she sent him north with a paper bag of biscuits and a thermos she told him to mail back, and which he never did, because he could not bring himself to part with it. He meant to come back. People always mean to come back. The bed in Shreveport led to a job, and the job led to a trade, and Cole turned out to be good with broken things, the way some men are. He apprenticed under a contractor, then under a structural engineer who took a liking to the quiet ex-Marine who never cut a corner, and within 4 years, Cole had his own small firm restoring old buildings. The rest of the market had written off. He sent the thermos back in his mind 100 times, and never in the mail. He told himself there would be time. There is a particular kind of grief that comes from learning too late that someone else kept a door open for you while you told yourself you would walk through it eventually. Birch grew old in those years the way good dogs do, gray coming into the black mask of his face, slower on the stairs, but never far from Cole's side, sleeping across the doorway of whatever room Cole worked in, the same posture he had held in the bus shelter, the body of an animal who had decided what was his to guard. The dog was 11 now, and Cole was 33, and the firm had grown enough that Cole could finally do a thing he had been turning over for 2 years. He could go back to Marsh Landing and find the woman who handed him $1 in the rain, and he could pay a debt that had never once felt like it was getting smaller. He did not know when he drove south that spring that he was already too late for the simple version of paying it back, and just in time for the hard one. Marsh Landing had changed in 10 years, and not in the direction towns hope to change. The shrimp had thinned. The young people had left. Half the storefronts on the main road were dark. Cole drove past the bus shelter, still standing, still doing nothing against the weather, and his chest tightened in a way he had not let it tighten in a long time. Then he drove the 2 blocks to the breakfast counter, and the windows were papered over from the inside, and a notice was taped to the glass door. And Birch, stiff from the long drive, pressed his nose to the bottom of the door and would not move. The notice was a foreclosure posting. The counter had been closed for 9 weeks. The building and the small apartment above it, where Delphine had lived for 3 decades, were scheduled for auction in 22 days. Cole stood on the sidewalk a long time. Then he went looking for her. He found her in a county facility 11 miles inland, a long, low building with a name that promised more than the place delivered, where the hallways smelled of disinfectant, and the televisions were always on, and nobody ever seemed to be watching them. Delphine was 80 now. She was smaller than he remembered, and her hands shook when they were not folded in her lap. But her eyes were the same. And when the dog walked into the room ahead of Cole, those eyes filled, before she had even placed who the man behind the dog was. Birch crossed the room and put his gray head in her lap as if no 10 years had passed. The old woman bent over him and made a sound. Cole had heard, once before in a rainstorm, the sound a person makes when something they had decided to stop, expecting walks back through the door. She remembered the $1. She remembered the dog. It took her a moment to fit the broad-shouldered man into the boy she had fed, and when she did, she said his name like a question and then like an answer, and Cole sat down beside her and held one of her shaking hands in both of his and could not, for a while, say anything at all. The story came out slowly over that first afternoon and the visits that followed. After the counter's business had thinned with the town, Delphine had fallen behind. A man had come to her counter, a pleasant man in a pressed shirt, who said he represented a company that helped older property owners stay in their homes. His name was Garrett Vance, and the company was called Coastline Heritage Holdings. And the program he offered was a reverse arrangement against the building, money now, against the equity later. But terms, he explained in a soothing voice, and a stack of paper she signed at her own kitchen table because he was patient and kind and she was tired and alone, and the property tax was past due. What she had signed was not what he had described. The soothing voice had walked her into a balloon payment she could never make, a default trigger buried in the language, and a clause that handed Coastline the building for a fraction of its worth the moment she missed a payment. She had missed a payment in the 9th week of the counter being closed, while she was in the facility recovering from a fall, unable to get to the bank. The default had triggered. The auction had been scheduled. Garrett Vance had visited her exactly once after that, to express his sympathy and to suggest gently that a woman her age was better off not carrying the burden of a building anyway. Cole listened to all of it with his jaw set and his hand steady on the old dog's back, and the longer he listened, the quieter he got, which was the thing the men he worked with had learned to be most careful around. Combat had never made him feel the way this made him feel. There is a particular cold that settles in a decent man when he watches the patient machinery that exists to take things from people who cannot fight back. He did not go and find Garrett Vance and put a hand on him. He wanted to. He drove past the coastline office in the county seat twice and sat in the truck with the engine running and the dog watching him from the passenger seat. And then he drove away both times, because a man who solves a thing with his hands solves nothing, and because the woman in the facility had told him 10 years ago to be one of the people who showed up. And showing up the wrong way is just leaving with extra steps. So he showed up the right way, which is slower and harder, and the only way that holds. He started with the paper. Cole had spent a decade learning that the truth of any old structure is in its documents, the permits and the liens and the chain of title, the boring pages nobody reads until everything depends on them. He requested the full file on the building from the county recorder. He read the reverse arrangement Delphine had signed, line by line, at a motel desk with the dog asleep at his feet, and he found the thing he was looking for around 2 in the morning, which was the date. The contract had been executed and notarized on a Tuesday in October. Cole knew that date. He knew it because he had read, in the facility's intake records that Delphine had given him permission to see, that she had been admitted after her fall on the Sunday before that Tuesday and had not been discharged for 19 days. The notary stamp said she had signed in person in the county seat on a day she had been lying in a bed 11 miles away with a fractured hip. Someone had signed for her, or the stamp was false, or both. Either way, the document that handed her life's work to Coastline Heritage Holdings was built on a notarization that could not be true. Cole did not celebrate. He had learned that a single thread is not a rope. A clever company that builds a default trigger into a contract for a tired old woman is a company that has done this before and will have an answer ready. He needed more than one thread. He needed the kind of pattern that institutions cannot wave away. And to find a pattern, he needed the town, and the town did not know him. This is where the showing up began in earnest. He went back to the breakfast counter, the dark one with the papered windows, and he found the man who owned the hardware store next door, a wide, slow man named Roy Pettijohn, who had known Delphine for 40 years and had been quietly furious for 9 weeks with nowhere to put it. Cole introduced himself as the boy she had fed in the rain a long time ago, and Roy looked at him and looked at the gray dog, and something in his face came loose, because he half remembered the story. Delphine had told it. She had told it for years, the boy and the dog and the dollar. The way people tell the stories that prove to themselves the world is not only what it appears to be. Roy made calls. By the end of the week, Cole was sitting in the back of the hardware store with 4 people who had each been approached by Garrett Vance, 2 who had signed and lost property, and 2 who had not signed and watched their neighbors lose it. A retired schoolteacher named Vivian Boudreau had kept every piece of paper Coastline had ever sent her, because keeping things was what teachers did, and her file was thick and ugly and full of the same buried language that had trapped Delphine. An oysterman named Hollis had a recording on his phone, made without thinking much about it, of Vance promising in his soothing voice that the arrangement could never cost a person their home, a promise the contract flatly contradicted. The back room smelled of cut keys and machine oil, and Roy had pulled folding chairs into a rough circle under a single hanging bulb. Vivian came in with a banker's box held against her chest and set it down on the workbench with a weight that said she had been waiting 9 weeks to set it down in front of someone who would do something. She had taught school in Marsh Landing for 34 years. Half the people in the county had learned to read at her table, and she spoke now, the way she must have once called a room of children to order. plain and certain, and impossible to talk over. She laid out what Coastline had sent her, letter by letter, dated, and when she got to the page where the soothing language turned into a number she could never pay, her hand flattened on the paper and stayed there. Hollis was a big, quiet man with hands cracked from 40 years of oyster sacks, and he did not say much, but he set his phone on the workbench and played the recording, and the soothing voice filled the back room, promising a thing the paper had already taken away, and the people in the folding chairs went very still, listening to it. When it ended, nobody spoke for a moment. Then a thin man in the corner, who had lost his late brother's house, said, low, that he had heard that exact voice at his own kitchen table, the exact words, and Cole understood then that Vance had a script, that he said the same gentle sentences in house after house, and that a script said enough times becomes a pattern. And a pattern is a thing the law can finally see. One by one, the threads became a rope. Birch came to those meetings. The old dog would settle himself in the middle of the room, and the people would arrange themselves around him without quite noticing they were doing it, hands dropping to his gray head as they talked, and Cole watched the way the dog steadied the room, the way an animal that has decided a place is his to guard makes the humans in it braver than they were. Vivian said it out loud one evening. She said the dog made the back room feel like something worth defending. Nobody laughed at her. They all felt it. They were not, any of them, fighters by nature. They were a hardware man, and a teacher, and an oysterman, and a handful of others who had spent their lives being decent in a place that was emptying out around them. What they had that Coastline had not counted on was that they knew each other, and they showed up for each other, and once Cole gave them a shape to pour their anger into, they poured it in fast. The shape was evidence, and the channel was the law, and the deadline was the auction, 22 days out and shrinking. Cole built the file the way he built a restoration, from the foundation up. The false notarization on Delphine's contract, Vivian's preserved paper trails showing the same trap laid for others. Hollis's recording, the pattern of Coastline targeting owners over 70, in a county where the young had left and the old held the deeds. A title search that showed Coastline had flipped 6 Marsh Landing properties in 3 years to a holding company at a different address that turned out, after Cole spent 2 nights with the corporate filings, to share an officer with Coastline itself. Garrett Vance was not buying these buildings to help anyone stay in them. He was running them through a wash and selling them to himself. He worked it at the motel desk, under a lamp that buzzed, with the corporate filings spread across the bed and the floor, because the desk was too small to hold them. The filings were public and boring, and almost nobody ever reads them, which is exactly why men like Vance hide inside them. Cole read every page. He found a holding company called Tidewater Equity at an address in the county seat, and Tidewater had bought 4 of the 6 flipped buildings, and the registered agent for Tidewater was a name he did not recognize until he cross-checked it against Coastline's own incorporation papers and found the same signature on both, the same officer, the same hand. A man had sold his own stolen buildings to himself, through a company he controlled, to make a theft look like a sale. It was patient, and it was clean. And it would have worked on anyone who did not have the time and the training to sit with the paper for 2 nights running. Cole had both. The dog slept across the motel doorway while he worked, and once, near 3 in the morning, when Cole finally sat back and understood the whole shape of it, the old dog lifted his head as if he had heard the moment land, and then put it back down. It was patient, ordinary, paperwork evil, the kind that wears a pressed shirt and a soothing voice, and it had never once expected that the boy in the bus shelter would grow up to read contracts for a living and come back 11 days before the auction, Cole drove to the county seat and walked into the office of the only person he had decided to trust with the file. An assistant district attorney named Marion Cho, who had built a small reputation prosecuting elder fraud and had almost no resources to do it with. He set the file on her desk. He did not raise his voice. He walked her through the notarization that could not be true, and the recording and the pattern and the shared officer, and when he was done, she sat looking at it for a long moment, and then asked him a question he had not expected. She asked him why he cared. He was not from here. He had a firm 3 states away. Most people who found a thing like this walked past it. Cole was quiet for a while. Then he told her about the rain and the bench and the dollar, and the woman who handed him the last of what she had and told him a man and his dog should eat. He said he had spent 10 years meaning to pay it back, and he had finally come to do it, and he had found her in a county bed 11 miles from the building that was her whole life, with a pleasant man in a pressed shirt about to take it. He said he was not going to walk past it. He said it plainly, the way he said most things, and Marion Cho looked at the gray dog sitting at his feet, and then at the file on her desk and told him she would need everything he had organized by the end of the week. The next 9 days were the kind of work that does not look like heroism, and is. Vivian organized her decades of paper into a timeline a jury could follow. Roy drove 3 of the older property owners to the county seat to give statements because they did not drive at night anymore, and he did. Hullis swore out an affidavit about the recording. Cole pulled the corporate filings into a single clean chain that showed the wash sales, building to building, owner to owner, all roads leading back to Garrett Vance. He did not sleep much. The dog slept across the motel doorway every night, and every morning was stiffer than the last, and Cole noticed and said nothing, because there are some arithmetic problems a man does not let himself solve until he has to. Marion Cho filed for an emergency injunction to stop the auction 4 days before it was scheduled. The hearing was set for the morning of the 3rd day. The night before the hearing, Cole drove out to the facility and sat with Delphine and told her what was going to happen, that a judge would decide in the morning whether the auction could go forward, that there were no guarantees, that the people she had fed for 31 years had organized themselves into something Coastline had not seen coming. The old woman listened with the dog's head in her lap. When he finished, she was quiet, and then she reached over with one shaking hand and touched the gray fur of the dog's notched ear, and she said the thing that broke 10 years of Cole's careful armor clean in half. She said she had thought, when the boy and the dog left on the bus, that she would never know whether the dollar had landed anywhere. She said most kindnesses you throw into the dark and never hear them land. She said she had made her peace with that a long time ago. Then she looked at the man the boy had become and said very simply that she was glad she had lived long enough to hear this one land. Cole had not cried in front of another person since his mother's funeral. He cried in that county room with the televisions murmuring down the hall and the old dog between them and the old woman's hand shaking against the dog's ear, and he was not ashamed of it. And the dog leaned his whole weight into the both of them the way he had leaned toward her into the rain 10 years before. The hearing the next morning was not dramatic in the way movies promise. It was a small courtroom and a tired judge and Marion Cho laying out a timeline so clean and so damning that there was very little for anyone to argue. The false notarization was the spine of it. A document signed in person in the county seat on a day the signer was provably in a hospital bed 11 miles away is not a document a court can pretend to honor. Coastline's lawyer, a smooth man cut from the same cloth as Vance, tried to call it a clerical error. Marion Cho laid the recording beside it, and the pattern beside that, and the wash sales beside that, and the clerical error argument died in the room. Garrett Vance was not in the courtroom. Men like Vance rarely are. He had sent the lawyer. He was all ready. Marion Cho would learn over the following weeks, quietly dissolving Coastline Heritage Holdings and moving what he could to an address 2 states over, the way such men always have an exit mapped, before anyone else knows there is a door. He would not be dragged into a satisfying public reckoning. The investigation Marion opened would chase him through 3 shell companies, and some of it would stick, and some of it would not, and the largest part of the justice would arrive not as his punishment, but as the rescue of the people he had tried to take from. The judge granted the injunction. The auction was stopped, and in the weeks that followed, with the false notarization established and the pattern documented, the reverse arrangement against Delphine's building was voided in full. The default erased, the title cleared, and returned to the 80-year-old woman who had run a breakfast counter for 31 years and given a stranger her last dollar in the rain. A cleared title is not an open door, though, and a closed counter does not reopen itself, and an 80-year-old woman cannot climb the stairs to the apartment above it without help. The law could give her back the building. It could not give her back the life inside it. That part was not the court's to do. That part belonged to the town and to the man who had come back. And this is the part nobody saw coming. Cole did not pay off the building and drive home. He stayed. He moved into the motel by the week, and then he and Roy Petitjean started on the counter. Cole was, after all, a man who restored old buildings the rest of the market had written off, and there was no building in the world he wanted to restore more than this one. He stripped the papered windows. He rebuilt the rotted sill under the front door where rain had gotten in. Vivian Boudreau organized a schedule of volunteers the way she had once organized a classroom, and people who had said for 9 weeks that they wished there was something they could do discovered that there was. And they showed up with paint and with tools and with casseroles for the workers. The dark counter filled up with the sound of people who had decided a place was worth defending. Hollis, the oysterman, rewired the old grill himself. A retired carpenter Cole had not yet met turned out to live 4 doors down and rebuilt the counter stools that had gone to splinters. Someone's granddaughter, home from college, repainted the sign above the door in the same letters it had worn for 31 years. And when she was done, she would not take money for it either, because she had grown up eating at that counter and had not known until that spring that it had almost disappeared. The work took 3 weeks, and Cole ran it the way he ran a Restoration Anywhere foundation first, then the bones, then the things people see. He found rot in the floor joists under the grill and replaced them on his back, in the crawl space, with the dog lying at the open hatch above him, watching. He matched the new sill to the old wood, so you could not tell where one ended and the other began, because that was the kind of work Delphine deserved and the kind he did not know how to do any other way. Roy kept the hardware store running with one hand and handed tools through the connecting wall with the other. Vivian appeared every afternoon at 3 with a thermos of coffee and a list of who was coming the next day, and she ran the volunteers the way she had run 34 years of classrooms, which is to say nothing got past her and nobody left early. The thin man, who had lost his brother's house, turned out to be a fair hand with a paintbrush, and came every day and said little, and worked until dark. A place comes back the way it goes down, one person at a time, except that going down is lonely and coming back is not. Cole brought Delphine back from the facility on a clear morning in early summer. He drove out himself, with the dog in the back seat, and he wheeled her chair up the new ramp he had built where the broken step had been, and he opened the door of her counter for her, the door that 9 weeks before had worn a foreclosure notice and now wore fresh paint and a small brass bell that rang when it swung. The town was inside. All of them. The hardware man and the teacher and the oyster man and the carpenter and the granddaughter and a dozen more, standing in the small, bright room they had brought back from the dead. And when the old woman rolled through the door, they did not cheer, because that was not the kind of town it was. They just stood and let her see it, and let her understand that the place was hers again, and that none of them were going anywhere. Delphine Aucoin looked at the counter she had opened at 5 in the morning for 31 years. She looked at the stools, and the grill, and the sign, and the bell. Then she looked at the man who had been a boy in a bus shelter, and at the gray dog who had crossed the room 10 years and an hour ago to put his head in her lap, and she said the only thing there was to say, which was that she had thought the dollar landed nowhere, and instead, she wheeled herself slowly along the counter, touching things as she went, the worn edge of the grill, the new stools that sat where the splintered ones had been, the brass bell by the door that had not been there before. At the window she stopped. Where the morning light came in over the sill, Cole had matched so carefully to the old wood, and she looked out at the main road for a long moment. Then she asked, in a voice gone thin, who had done all this. Roy Petitjean cleared his throat and said the whole town had, which was true. Vivian said it had been the boy's idea, which was also true. The granddaughter, who had painted the sign, said quietly that they had done it because Delphine had fed half of them for free at one time or another over 30 years. And nobody had ever said thank you properly, and the old woman put her hand over her mouth and did not try to speak after that. The dog crossed the bright room and lay down in the patch of sun by the window as if he had always lived there. And after a while Delphine reached down and rested her shaking hand on his side, and the room let her have the moment, and nobody rushed it. Cole stayed in Marsh Landing. He did not announce it as a decision. He simply did not leave, the way a man who has spent his whole life leaving learns, finally, to stay by stopping. He moved his firm's small southern operations into the empty storefront beside the hardware store. He restored 3 more of the buildings Coastline had hollowed out and sold none of them to himself. And the main road that had been half dark began slowly to fill back in. He took his coffee every morning at the counter. The old woman fed him still and asked for nothing, and got, in the simple fact of his being there, the only thing she had ever wanted, which was to know that showing up was still a thing people did. On Sundays, Roy and Vivian and Hollis came in too, and the narrow room that had nearly gone to auction filled again with the ordinary noise of people who had decided to belong to a place and to each other. And that noise, more than any judge's order, was the sound of the thing being truly won back. Birch lived out his last good year in that town, sleeping in the warm patch of sun by the counter window, where Delphine could reach down and touch his notched ear, guarding the room he had decided was his. And when the old dog finally went, he went whole and old and loved, in a place that was home. With the woman he had turned to follow into the rain, a decade before resting her shaking hand on his side. Cole buried him in the little plot behind the counter, and he did not grieve the dog the way he had once grieved everything, alone and on the move, because this time there was a town standing beside him and an old woman holding his arm, and that is the difference between losing something on the road and losing it at home. If you have ever handed someone the last of what you had and watched them disappear and made your quiet peace with never knowing whether it mattered, here is what this story would say to you. Kindness is not a transaction, and it does not come back to you on any schedule you can predict. And most of it you will throw into the dark and never hear it land, yet some of it lands. Some of it grows in soil you will never see, in a life you touched once in the rain, and comes walking back to you years later with everything it became. You do not get to choose which kindnesses land. You only get to keep handing out the dollar. May God watch over you and the people you have shown up for, and the people who, one day, when you least expect it, will show up for you. Stay kind and stay until morning, because everything else, all of it, can wait until then.